Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 14 of the Ask Historians podcast, the Tarascans, part 2, with myself interviewing Snickeringshadow. This is actually turning out to be a special 4th of July edition. So for the American listeners, please enjoy this wonderful Independence Day by listening to the podcast while you wait to blow things up and eat hot dogs. And if you are not American and you are listening to this podcast, please eat a hot dog and blow something up while doing it. So, in the meantime, please enjoy part 2. We'll be covering the later parts of the Tarascan Empire, all the way from the founding of the Kingdom of Sinsunzan, all the way to essentially the coming of the Spanish and kind of the anticlimax that happens afterwards. So, enjoy.
Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
All right, welcome back, everyone. This is part 2 with Snickeringshadow about the Tarascan Empire, or what we now know as the Tarascan Empire. But of course, we've already learned in part 1, which if you haven't listened to, you probably should, because otherwise the rest of this won't make too much sense. So, Snickeringshadow, when we left off, Tariakuri, had just passed away, and having established basically a basin-wide empire, the zygote of what would become what we now call today the Tarascan Empire. So can you kind of go into how the politics and the relations of that state progressed post his death?
Okay, so in the early days of the empire, it really wasn't very different from what you see in a lot of other Mesoamerican empires. This was really an alliance of 3 city-states that were united by a single royal lineage that established sort of a tributary model with other nearby communities, where other communities were required to pay tribute into the system, and it was distributed amongst the 3 different centers. And they started expanding almost immediately, like right after Teriakuri's death. Iripan took over the empire and immediately began expanding into the mountains surrounding the lake basin. And over the next couple emperors, they started pushing those borders a little further and a little further until eventually they reached Quitseo, which Lake Quitseo is another one of these major lakes in the area. It's kind of on the northeastern border of the modern state of Michoacan. And that was another area that had a tradition of what we call complex society, larger settlements, an archaeological tradition that goes back to the classic period, really. So this was sort of doubled the size of the empire. And what they kind of did was they started to very slowly phase in a series of reforms that gave them more control. And one of the things they did was they found out, okay, so all these lords have ways of making alliances with each other that circumvent the state by using strategic marriage. It's part of the tradition of the region. And so in order to sort of gain control over this, what they did was they set up a system where, okay, no longer can 2 lords have a marriage alliance with each other. Instead, all these other subject people, the subject nobility, have to send their daughters to the king when they come of age, and they will live with the king in the palace. In fact, they were told that the king's palace was staffed entirely by women that were noble daughters. So he basically took control over all of the women nobility and would dole them out to other lords as for marriage. And I don't know
the usurpation of this previously independent strategic marriage.
Right. It's sort of like added, like within a complex network of marriage alliances, the king became a nexus in this network. So all marriage alliances had to go through him. And so when a lord gave up his daughter, he was giving it to the king. That established a relationship with the king. And then when the king married off a daughter, the king acted sort of like the fictive kin father of the daughter, giving her away to the lord. So it created the loyalty for these marriage alliances was reinforced to the king instead of to the local nobility.
So there's kind of a centralization of these political marriages then.
Yes, that's a good way to describe it, I think. The other thing they did was they also made it so that lords no longer could administer their communities directly. Instead, the lords of these communities lived in the capital with the king, and they had sort of appointed officials that managed the day-to-day affairs in their home communities. Yeah, so that was the main way that they maintained control of the nobility. But in areas outside the lake basin, they started finding it difficult to control all of these different peoples. There were frequent rebellions. I mean, this is something that the Aztecs had as well. It's part of the tributary model. You leave people in charge, and they're eventually they're going like, well, why am I paying tribute to you? So it's
a state based on the assumption that people will rebel.
Yeah, exactly. So they decided to get rid of these rebellions, and the way they did it was they got rid of the local nobility and replaced them all with nobility who were appointed by the royal dynasty. And the people who they appointed were all from either Chichimecs themselves or from the islanders, because some of the islanders had sort of sided with the Chichimecs during the conquest, so they got special privilege. And so they put islander.
If I could just interject for a quick point, because I think this often gets brought up in conversations, at least about the Aztecs, in reference to the Tarascans, as the Aztecs is more of what's called, more a hegemonic empire, where of course, the idea was not to replace the local leaders, but simply have those local leaders, swear kind of tributary status to the Aztec elites back in the basin of Mexico, but otherwise leave the state unchanged, state and rulership. But a lot of times the Tarascans are called more of a centralized empire, I guess you could say. It's precisely because of this.
Right. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily go as far as to call them territorial, except in some respects. I think Ross Hassig had a good phrase. He called them semi-territorial. Mm-hmm. They had a territorial strategy in some areas, which I would identify more as an attempt to directly control local things. But in most ways, I would describe it more as a centralized empire. I think that's a good way to put it, because it's not so much that they're, investing stuff in they're not investing in local infrastructure or politics, but they're sort of centralizing it so that everything has to go through the capital. There's no, local autonomy was cut down. So one of the ways they did this, like I said, was replacing local lords with people that they appointed. And rather than having these lords be able to decide their own succession, all the members of that lineage would come to the capital when the previous lord died, and they would bring the implements of office with them, and the Tarascan monarch would take these implements and bestow them on the next successor directly. So their position was entirely defined by their relationship with the Irecha, the king.
So how did the state expand then after Tarascan?
Well, I mean, it was more wars of conquest, very similar in many other ways. Well, the biggest difference was just, replacing local nobility.
I mean, were there major rivals that they had to take care of in the region, or?
Well, they had some difficulties with during the later reign. They had some difficulties with Colima in West Mexico, but they never really conquered that region. But otherwise, no. I mean, there weren't really any. I don't know of any centralized or strongly. There were a couple towns that put up some truculent resistance, but nothing.
There wasn't any kind of real rivals at that point.
Right, nothing like the Aztecs had with Tlaxcala or something like that. They did. The other thing they did was they also established a separate tributary system. They appointed these officials known as Ocambecha, who theoretically, each Ocambecha was in charge of a unit of 25 households, and was charged with keeping census of how many people lived in his district, and making sure that tribute and labor requirements were carried out by the population. And this was separate from the local nobility. It was a separate bureaucracy that reported directly to the king in the capital. So
kind of analogous to the Calpixque of the Aztecs then.
Similar, yes, but they actually lived in the communities where they were exacting tribute. They were local appointed officials who lived in the community and exacted tribute from that unit. And I have a passage here from the Relación de Michoacan, which I kind of want to read a couple sentences from.
Please do.
So this is just to give you an idea of the sort of bureaucracy that the Tarascans created. There was another representative called Tarata Wapani was over all those who were in charge of the king's seed plots. He was the major domo or principal supervisor assigned over all the seed plots in the province. Therefore, there was another supervisor over each seed plot in each of the villages who had it seeded, weeded, harvested for the wars and offerings to the gods. Another supervisor was in charge of more than 2,000 officials whose work was to build houses, with another 1,000 for the renovations of the temples they constructed. Often they did nothing but build houses and temples ordered by the king, and many of these still exist. One official called a karaki was the principal supervisor of all stonemasons and quarries. He had other helpers there. There were still many of them. He had other helpers, and there are still many of these with their supervisors in charge of them. There was another official called Kwanikoti, chief of all the hunters who brought in deer and rabbits for the king. There were also bird hunters in case you want this kind of game. There was another official called Kuru Apinidi who supervised hunting of ducks and quail, skipping ahead a little bit. There was a person called Varuri who's in charge of all the fishermen who supplied fish to the king and all the lords, skipping ahead a bit more. There was a principal assigned to receive and store the corn and bee honey brought before the king. There was another official tavern keeper called the Atari to receive all the maguey wine that was made for all the feasts. This literally goes on for, I'm counting, 1, 2, 4 pages. 4 pages just listing different bureaucrats that exist within the Tarascan government, who they report to. It's almost like incomprehensible how large the bureaucracy was that they created. They created a way to sort of regulate every aspect of life that the king interacted with went through bureaucracy.
Was this something that it was co-opting, previously extant bureaucracies, or was this something that was created basically, completely new?
I think it's new. It's new in a sense, but there's a scholar named Ulysses Beltran who makes a decent argument, which is that a lot of the Purepecha culture, which the Purepecha is the name of the ethnic group, a lot of their culture prior to contact involved lineages. If you were a farmer, it's because you came from a farmer's lineage. If you were a woodworker, it was because your parents were woodworkers. And so
they caste system then.
Similar to a caste system, yeah, but it's almost sort of described like guilds would be a good analogy. They sort of organize a lot of these groups. He makes the argument that a lot of them sort of organized themselves in some way because they were all hereditary members of this. An analogy, I guess, would be similar to the Pochteca among the Aztecs. And they did have something similar. The Tarascans had the name eludes me right now. It'll come back. They had a merchant, an organization of merchants similar to the Pochteca, but it's similar in that it's an endogamous unit that's sort of self-regulating. And so in this case, the creation of the bureaucracy was not so much creating new institutions, but rather appointing officials to be in charge of the existing institutions.
So it's like an officialization, if that is a word,
yeah,
of what is kind of freestanding, but also in making those things official, also making it much more kind of standardized and regulated. That's
a way to describe it. But again, this is sort of, this is an argument. It's not my argument. I'm pretty sure I'm drawing this from Ulysses Beltran. I hope I am not just making it up. But, there's not really any way to know this for sure. That's just sort of one of the models that's been proposed.
The general problem of studying Mesoamerican history is that, well, we have ideas, but nothing concrete. Yeah.
Yeah.
So at this point, we basically have an expanding Tarascan empire. At what point did it kind of reach its? At what point did the easy conquests end, and the fact that the kind of having to interact with the larger states around them, i.e., the Aztecs, kind of begin?
Well, that actually started really in the 1470s. So after the first 3 monarchs. There was, Idipan, Tangashuan, and Ikingahe. And those were all the 3 that Teriakuri had appointed as his successors, right? So he set the official succession for the first 3 rulers after him. The first ruler that was not appointed by Teriakuri was Tsitsis Pandakware. And he is credited with pretty much doubling the size of the empire at that point. By the time he took over, they had controlled Lake Pátzcuaro, a lot of the surrounding mountainous regions, and had expanded into the Lake Cuitzeo basin, and he took the expansions much further than that. He took them to he actually conquered areas north of the Lerma River, which, to give you sort of an idea of the geography, the Lerma River is on the northern border of the modern state of Michoacan. It kind of runs east-west, and then there's another river kind of running diagonally southwest and northeast called the Rio Balsas, which form the southern border. So he expanded to the Rio Lerma and actually began establishing settlements north of the Rio Lerma, moved west, went into conflict with Colima, which was another powerful political entity on the Pacific coast, and south all the way to he actually conquered the port of Zacatula. Zacatula was a major port on the mouth of the Rio Balsas on the Pacific coast, and it was a major center of trade. So he conquered Zacatula, and east he pushed as far as the Toluca Valley in central Mexico. And for this sort of weird, brief moment in time between 1470 and about 1476 to 1478-ish, the Tarascans were the largest empire in Mesoamerica. The kingdom of Tzintzuntzan, after this point, would cover about 75,000 square kilometers, and it was larger than that before this conflict. But unfortunately, his expansions eastward proved a bit troublesome because by expanding towards the Toluca Valley, he actually started conquering territory that had previously been conquered by another empire, which we know as the Aztecs. So they began expanding about the same point in time, and the Aztecs had first conquered Toluca and some of its surrounding areas, and then the Tarascans moved in there and conquered some of that territory. And in 1476 or I've heard different dates for this. 1476 is the one I've been using, but
yeah, I mean, I think Hassig gives it in 1479, 1478, 79.
I mean, I've heard 76, 77, 78. 79 is the first I've heard of that, but it's late 1470s.
Part of the reason is, of course, that most of these, given the wet, dry, kind of tropical climate of the region, the fact that most military campaigns were carried out in the winter, so you end up having campaigns start in one year and end in another. So
it's hard to move armies through the mud. Yeah, no, I understand that. That's probably what happened. But the Aztecs, and I believe it was it Ashayakat was the reigning emperor at this point?
Yeah, Ashayakat.
Okay, so he moved back into the Toluca Valley, drove the Tarascans out, and then launched a large invasion of the empire of the kingdom of Tzintzuntzan.
Yeah, something like numbers are given something like 24,000 to 32,000 men.
Right, and he managed to blow through some of the Aztec border communities. He got as far as Taximaroa, which was a town, probably a fairly small city or large town, located near the eastern end of the kingdom of Tzintzuntzan. And he moved into that area, and eventually the Tarascans ambushed him with a larger army, composed. I mean, I think the higher end estimates I've seen are like 50,000 soldiers. And basically
actually there's a passage in Duran where they explicitly say they have 16,000 men more than us.
Yeah, so it's a lot. And they crush them. You have to realize that the bow and arrow was really an important part of the Tarascan military compared to other Mesoamerican armies. So that gave them a lot of amazing range. They appear to have kept up a lot of their archery tradition from their Chichimeque heritage, so they really were very good archers, and they outnumbered them, and they were fighting the defensive war, so they knew the terrain better, and it really was not a contest. I mean, the Aztec army was completely crushed, and I believe Ashayakat was wounded, wasn't he? In the conflict.
He was, yeah.
Yeah.
Actually, I as you have a quote, I also have a quote from, this is from Duran's History of the Indies of New Spain, talking about this. So the Aztecs attacked the Tarascan army, but the assault was so unsuccessful that they fell into the hands of the Tarascans, like flies that fall into water. At least that is what the Chronicle says. The massacre was so great that Ashayakat decided to withdraw those men who were still alive in order to save at least a few. In this encounter, the Tarascans killed many valiant Aztecs, especially from the military orders called the Quashchik and the Otomi. Among the fallen was a nobleman, But it's kind of this thing where, they list that they went in there with several thousand, and they come out with, a few hundred at most.
Yeah. So, but this actually it scared the Tarascans because, yes, they beat the Aztecs, but they got pretty close. I mean, they managed to blow right through the border, and they almost, if they hadn't stopped them where they did, they might have reached the capital, and that would have been, really bad. I mean, it's actually this, the sophisticated bureaucracy that the that they had designed, that where everything was dependent on the Irecha as the king, created a situation where in later times you would get these instances where someone would take the king prisoner or try to usurp power from the king, and once that happened, once
when you have the centralized bureaucracy, if you cut off the head,
you
and you
control
can see
the head,
yeah. And exactly kind of what happened with Moctezuma Xochitl during the conquest with the Spanish as well.
Right. So they were really scared that that the Aztecs were going to reach the capital, and so they decided to change strategies. So like I said, they were still expanding when this war broke out, but they stop expanding at this point. They pull back their northern frontier to the Rio Lerma. They abandon their settlements on the northern side of the Rio Lerma and fall back to the Rio Lerma. They stop expanding west. They decide they're going to leave Colima out of it for now, and they sort of consolidate things on their eastern border. And there's actually been some really good work, at the very least, very interesting work, on the north.
Damning with faint praise.
Yeah, on the northern end of the of this frontier that was by Shirley Gorenstein in the 1980s. Did some interesting archaeological work on in this region, and what appears to have happened is that when the Aztecs, the dust settled from this war, and you got the Aztecs began creating conditions in their territories that had they started basically imposing a kind of collective punishment on the territories that had sided with the Tarascans in this conflict. They were not happy that they had switched allegiances so quickly, and so what ended up happening was that there was a lot of these border communities started to swell in population. Gorenstein did some work at a place called Acámbaro, and I'm going to use this as kind of my case study for what the military frontier looked like because it's got the best research. But keep in mind that this is one of the larger of the military frontier communities. So there's these mountain ranges that are between the Aztec and the Tarascan territory. And what the Tarascans basically did was they put a fort at each of these mountain ranges. There were a lot of Otomi peoples that were finding conditions in the Aztec Empire very unpleasant, given.
Well, actually, it's kind of as a brief aside, when we're talking about this kind of border region, we're not talking about Nahua peoples and Purepecha. We're talking about other peoples within the range of the conquest of those two empires that are kind of coming together. This is a region that's ethnically, I wouldn't call it ethnically homogenous, but a lot of these people that are living in this region don't have ethnic ties with each other that they don't have with either empire that they're subjected to. The Otomi was a major ethnic group in this region, and a lot of them start leaving the Aztec area because the Aztecs are very upset with them for helping the Tarascans, and so they start moving west into the Tarascan territory. And the reigning king, who this might have still been Tsitsis Pandacuare, but it might have also been Zuangua at this point. The reigning monarch in the kingdom of Zinzunzan decides to give them some territory on his eastern border and says, okay, you know what, fine, you can settle here, you can have this land. The only thing I ask in return is that you garrison these forts that I'm building. And at least on the northern end, where most of the survey work has been done, they're spaced about 30 to 50 kilometers apart, covering every major mountain pass or valley connecting the two regions. One of the largest of these communities was Acámbaro, because the Rio Lerma provided a nice broad valley that kind of cut through all these mountain ranges. So if you were going to invade, if you were going to march an army into there, the best way to do it would be to follow the Rio Lerma. And what they did was they built a fort on a hill where the river kind of makes a bend. The river's coming sort of northwest-ish as you're coming out of Aztec territory, and then it hooks around and starts going southwest. And right on the inside curve of this bend, there was a hill, and they built the fort right on top of the hill so that it had a nice view of the river in both directions. And there wasn't really any way to get past the fort without you falling into the range of the archers who would have been stationed there. And they also put smaller forts, more like watchtowers, further down the way and on either direction, so that they could have an even more advanced notice that there's somebody coming, and they could relay it to the main fort, and the main fort could be ready for when they showed up. And the fact that they were spaced 30 to 50 kilometers apart meant that all of these forts and all the different passes and stuff were within communication range of each other. So if one of them fell under attack,
or they started to notice an army coming, they could send word to the other forts and get reinforcements. And they would also, by custom, send word to the capital and say, hey, there's somebody coming, you need to get an army ready to come after them. And they also put however, not just runners. Gorenstein actually has argued that some of them were in communication through signal fires, which is reasonable because we know from other parts of the historical document that they would use bonfires as a signal of war. So if you had, one fort in one valley, and then just on the other side of a ridge there was another fort, if one of them came under attack, they could just send up a big column of smoke, and that would let the people in the other fort know something's happening over there, and they need to get somebody over there to defend it.
Yeah, it's pretty well known practice. I would point out also that, at the same time that the Tarascans were kind of fortifying their border, the Aztecs were actually taking other steps to basically, secure their own border. So, the Codex Mendoza actually refers to these areas as the strategic provinces, because a lot of the, unlike in other provinces where basically the tribute demands were very, very high about luxury goods and all this, the tribute demands from these areas are actually pretty low when it comes down to it. It's almost kind of nominal. But the expectation was that these basically conquered city-states would be, puppet border states. So when, the Tarascans themselves would, launch attacks into Aztec territory, these states themselves would repel them by themselves. And of course, I think probably the most famous example of this is what would actually become an Aztec garrison at Aztoma. Or Otztoman, depending how you want to translate this. But that was actually a independent city-state which had been heavily fortified initially, but then later rebelled under the reign of not Ashiakat's successor, but Tizok, because he was incompetent and got murdered after about 5 years. But Tizok's successor, Ahuizot, who was one of the the great conquerors, that Otztoman rebelled against the Aztecs. Ahuizot came in with an army, basically destroyed the entire town, killed all the adults and sold all the children into slavery, and then replaced the town with married couples from the main, basin of Mexico. And then it became one of the, a famously fortified area in this region, which was the central Aztec fort from which they could project power. So there was kind of a fortification on both sides of the border here.
Yeah, well, and what's it's interesting because you get some of this too with the Tarascans. We have Shirley Gorenstein did excavations not just at the fort of Acámbaro, but also at the town that was associated with it, and from her sort of reconstruction of the archaeological record, it looks like it was a town that was largely Otomi prior to anything. But following the conquest by the kingdom of Zinzunzan, you get this large Purepecha population as various Tarascan nobility are moved into the area. You get 4 elite residences that show up that are using ceramic styles associated with Lake Pátzcuaro. And you get about 60 commoner residences that show up that are similar in that respect. And so as they conquered this area, the Otomi people that were living in the town remained there, and then they also sort of resettled some of the Purepecha peoples from Lake Pátzcuaro into that region. But then what happened was, as the Aztecs began making things difficult for the Otomi living on the other side of the border, there's another town nearby that was just across the border on the Aztec side called Jilotepec. That town started to shrink in population, and at the same time, the Otomi component of the population in Acámbaro started to grow. So you can actually, it requires a little bit of an assumption here, but you can actually kind of see the movement of peoples out of Aztec territory into the border communities on the Tarascan side. And as they do this, the Purepecha then step up their settlement of people from the Purepecha ethnicity. So you actually get 4 more elite residences from using Lake Pátzcuaro style ceramics that show up in the area. And then all of these different cultures throughout the rest of the site's occupation start to sort of meld together and produce a new local ceramic style. So there's a lot of resettlement of peoples that's going on as part of trying to populate this border region so you can have enough people to defend it against against this other expansive empire to the
there's
east.
a solidification of state level borders, even while the kind of ethnic borders are becoming much more kind of
Blurry.
blurry as well.
Yeah, so that's the interesting part about it. And another thing that's really interesting is that no one's ever really worked on the southern end of this border, which is primarily because that's where all the drug cartels are right now. So, there's kind of some reasons why no one's working down there. But the only real extensive work has been done is on the northern end. And the northern end was probably the most fortified version of it. The sources make it very clear that as people, from the Mexica, Aztecs, were not allowed into the Tarascan Empire unless they presented themselves at one of these border forts and waited for they had to go to the border forts and say, I'm an ambassador from Tenochtitlan, I'm here to deliver a message, and then the border forts would have to they'd have to wait there while the border forts sent a messenger to the capital saying there's an Aztec that wants to come in, can we let him in?
Well,
and then they would send a messenger back and say, okay, you're cleared, go ahead.
Yeah, well, it makes perfect sense because the Pozteca that we referenced earlier, they were long distance traders, but they were also very much spies when it came down to it. And I actually, to return to Hasek again, because he's written a lot on this subject, because he is kind of the Aztec warfare guy. The idea that one of the problems with the Aztecs moving in and conquering the Tarascan territory is that they didn't have any spies that could speak the language because they were kind of, so excluded from that.
Yeah.
So there was no way for them to kind of integrate into that society to kind of, gather intel.
Which it's actually the Tarascans were extremely effective at their use of spies on this frontier, because you got to remember most of the people that are garrisoning these forts are ethnically Otomi. They're people that have been driven out by the Aztecs. So they speak the language of all the people that are living on the other side of the border because they're also Otomi speakers, a lot of them. And they also have a lot of reason to hate the Aztecs because they're the ones who drove them out in the first place. So they would employ these Otomi spies, and we're told they had a very extensive spy network that sort of alerted the border forts long before anyone showed up at the actual border fort. They were aware that someone was coming. And I also just remembered the name of the Tarascan long-distance merchants were the Mayapeti, and they were able to they established these specific, they're sort of like the anti-Pozteca, they don't go beyond their own the borders of the empire, but they handle all trade within the empire's borders.
So with the setup, it seems remarkable because I think we both know is that after this initial push and defeat by Ashiakat, there's not really any major events that happen from there. It's almost kind of a stalemate.
Yeah, I think there was another. I have somewhere on my bookshelf over here, I have a book that talks about it, and I wish I pulled it out so I could remember the details. But there was another attempted invasion. It wasn't quite on the same scale, and I believe it came up sort of from the southeastern border. One of the big things that does happen is that Zacatula, remember that port city on the Balsas that was so big into trade up and down the Pacific, it switches allegiances over to the Aztecs. And I believe it then somehow manages to weasel its own independence out of that and becomes an independent city-state again. It's a story that I would like to actually really dive into, but I haven't really found a whole lot of primary sources on it.
We can put it up in the notes for this episode.
Yeah, hopefully someone can find something more on that. But I've only found like a couple passages for it in some other books, but no detailed treatment of how exactly that happened. So,
So, I don't want to jump too far ahead, but let's jump far ahead.
Okay, sure.
After this, kind of like late 1470s invasion, and then kind of a settlement, kind of a Cold War with, they're still shifting borders, but there's nothing, dramatic happening. The next, of course, event that really doesn't really happen in the Tarascan area, but happens from the east, is the landing of the Spanish, of course, on the coast of Veracruz, which throws the entire region into turmoil. At what point did the Tarascans learn about this landing? What do they know about the Spanish? How did this come through? You said they had spy networks, so what were these spy networks saying?
Well, they were. We actually have a lot of direct communication because the Aztecs were apparently sending regular messengers to the Tarascans and sort of informing them of what was going on. And so we actually kind of get their perspective on the whole thing. Although I should say this with a bit of a caveat before we get into this story. There's a so the historical source that most of this comes from is the Relación de Michoacan. It was written by a single guy whose name no one really knows for sure, but everyone's pretty sure that he was this guy Jerónimo de Alcalá. And he went there and interviewed a couple people. But all of his source, the only informant that he used for the conquest itself was this guy Kiniarangari. Now, Kiniarangari is an interesting person to choose as an informant because he's not really a neutral party in the events of what happens. He helps he sort of starts off on the king's side in this dispute that emerges around the time of the conquest, and then eventually leads a coup d'etat against the king and helps the conquistador Nuño de Guzman depose the Tarascan monarch. So this is the guy that's telling us the story of the conquest through the Spanish chronicler. And he kind of introduces some biases into the story.
Well, continuing the conquest account tradition of being
Right.
incredibly biased with an agenda.
Right. So like one of the things is he constantly presents the Tarascan monarch at the time of the conquest, a guy named Tangashuan II, as really weak and indecisive. And part of this is the Spanish bias, but part of it's, I think, is Kiniarangari's bias because while he's telling this to the Spanish chroniclers, he's planning a coup d'etat, which he will then subsequently execute a few years later. So, it's probably in his interest to make it seem like the current king is inept. The events that are given in the Relación de Michoacán do not match chronologically what we know from other sources. So, things were kind of jumbled up. They got a whole bunch of different messages, but the events that are happening seem to be out of sync. So one of the things, the first messenger that shows up from Tenochtitlan is describing the events of La Noche Triste. How the Spanish were driven out of the capital city and were sort of retreated back to Tlaxcala. And it's supposedly this messenger was sent by Moctezuma, but of course that cannot be true because Moctezuma was dead by this point.
Yeah,
so,
he was killed, and that's what kind of prompted the La Noche Triste.
Right, exactly. So they get this messenger, and the messenger comes and explains how these strange people have come from the east and how supposedly they took the Aztecs by surprise, and they describe how the Mexica, the Aztec core ethnic group, managed to kill hundreds of them, including some of them who were riding what they called deer, which obviously is horses.
Yeah, the mazat, yeah.
Yeah, horses. Deer is the closest that they had to horses. That's how they would make the analogy, and they actually have a description where they say they carried something that sounded like the clouds and makes a great thundering noise and kills all those that it meets, leaving not one. And they're describing this thing as being pulled by horses, so I think they're describing a cannon.
Yeah, one of the heavy cannons of the Spanish, of course. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's interesting. They kind of describe the first messengers arrive, and Zuangwa is the reigning monarch at this time. He's the king that's just followed Tzitzis Pandacuare. And Zuangwa listens to this story about these strange men with these strange weapons that have come over. They've caught the Aztecs by surprise. The Aztecs appear to have gained a victory, but the Aztecs have kind of come asking for military support, and Zuangwa kind of blows him off. He's like, I don't really have the troops to spare right now. They're out conquering, and so, I can't really send any troops. And,
hey, you are a major rival asking for help.
Yeah.
Let me see if I have some troops for you. Nope.
Right. So they go back to the Aztec capital where supposedly Moctezuma, though probably Cuitlahuac, the guy who succeeded him, sends them back and says, no, okay, go back and say, give them a different message. So they go. The messengers come back, and this time they give them like all this sweet talk and flowery message. They appeal to their shared Chichimeca ancestry and talk about how the Tarascans are such great archers and how how the gods had ordained two kingdoms to rule over this land. The chronicler says Michoacan and Mexico. And then he sort of plays up this shared ancestry, but once again Zuangwa doesn't buy it, and they kind of he actually launches into a debate about their religious differences. Zuangwa's, the Tarascan religion required constant burning of bonfires to honor the gods. That's their primary way of honoring the gods, was creating these big bonfires. And so he slams the Mexica for not bringing firewood for their gods, and how he's like, we have to. He even said, like, we have to burn more firewood to make up for your slack because you're not doing enough.
And I'm sure the Aztecs are like, the Mexica are like, well, look, do you know how many hearts we burn every year? What are you doing?
Yeah, right. So they sort of hash out this religious debate, and then the messengers leave again. And this time, there's more messages. It's this constant back and forth. The Aztecs send ambassadors to the Tarascans asking for help. The Tarascans tell them to, piss off, and then they go back to the Aztecs, and the Aztecs are like, okay, let's try something else. So they send them ambassadors back, and this happens several times. And eventually, one of the ambassadors explains that the Spanish have taken Texcoco, and they're building fleets on the lake. And they once again ask, like, can you send troops to help us drive out these foreigners? And they even give them a specific battle plan on how they could do this. He's like, we'll attack from one side, and while they're pinned down fighting us, you guys come in from the other direction, and we can get them in a pincer movement. And they have this whole battle plan planned out. And this time Zhuangzi basically just tells them straight up the truth. He's like, look, I don't trust you. I have no reason to trust you. And even if I did, I see no reason to fight your battles for you.
Yeah.
This is your problem.
And actually, this kind of ties into the fact that, what actually happened in Texcoco. As everyone who knows Aztec history, which is, so many of you, Texcoco was kind of the second group. The Mexica were the major part of the Aztec Empire, but the Acolba of Texcoco were kind of, this cultural heart and second most important area. But, prior to the Spanish arriving, there had been a bit of the Mexica had tried to appoint their own puppet ruler. There had been a civil war, and what had happened is when the Spanish came in, the Mexica puppet ruler of Texcoco fled back to Tenochtitlan, and the rival Texcocan ruler walked down and said, "Hey, Spanish, we're with you guys." So it basically, in one fell swoop, it had turned the entire, eastern side of the Aztec Empire over to the Spanish. So anyway.
Yeah. So this embassy then leaves, once again disappointed. The Tarascans are not going to help the Aztecs fight off the Spanish. As soon as they leave, all of a sudden there is a major smallpox outbreak in the Tarascan state. And this is likely the exact same smallpox outbreak that was happening in central Mexico. The Tarascan monarch Zhuangzi dies of smallpox, as do most of the nobility, most of the the sort of provincial governors who are governing the different, subject towns and cities in the provinces. A lot of them die. The high priest dies. A lot of the higher levels of the clergy die. I mean, it's just described as this horrible pestilence that kills lots and lots of people.
Yeah, and this is actually backed up by the Aztec sources as well, because these ambassadors to the Tarascans. Several different Aztec sources say that they sinned during the reign of Cuitlahuac or Cuauhtémoc. An embassy is sent to the Tarascans, but when they go there, they find that the region has been devastated already by smallpox. Possibly from previous ambassadors, possibly or whatever. And then the ambassadors themselves, as they come back, are actually die. They actually die of smallpox as well. So it is this backed up of this vast epidemic going through their land.
Yeah, and so then something rather complicated happens. So Zhuangzi dies, and a lot of his relatives die, and the one who ends up inheriting the throne at this point is this guy Zinzicha Tangashuan, who is also known as Tangashuan II, named after Tangashuan, one of the three brothers.
Mm-hmm.
What ends up happening is he takes the throne, and right after, he's a young kid. I mean, he's kind of described in his 20s-ish, probably. I mean, he's described as a young man, and he has this general named Timas. I've also seen his name spelled Timahe, so I'm not entirely sure, what the pronunciation actually was.
The orthography of spelling these languages has its own fraught history.
Yeah. So Timas basically convinces Tangashuan II that his other brothers, he's got 4 of his brothers, are planning to kill him and claim the throne for themselves. And apparently Tangashuan II buys this and kills his other brothers. Turns out that was not actually the case. Timas was trying to get Tangashuan to eliminate his brothers because Timas wanted to seize power for himself. And this is a very subtle thing that happens in the story. They don't ever explicitly say that Timas, seizes power in the capital. You kind of have to infer that from what happens in subsequent events. But it appears that what happened was that very subtly, after all of the other members of the royal dynasty had been eliminated and it was just Tangashuan II, Timas very subtly seizes power in the capital. And this happens primarily because Tangashuan II falls into a serious depression, which is completely understandable given that half of his relatives just died from smallpox, and then he murdered the other half under the mistaken impression that they were plotting to overthrow him. And at the same time, the Tenochtitlan had now fallen. The Aztec Empire had been conquered, and the Tarascans were sending ambassadors to go meet with Cortez, and they were having these exchanges where they were sort of learning about each other. And during one of them, they took these Tarascan ambassadors on a tour of the ruins of Tenochtitlan.
Yeah,
oh,
because
wow.
of course the Spanish technique, their basically strategy was to, because they were getting so much resistance from the city itself, is to tear down the city as they went. Basically destroy building by building as they advanced. Right.
So it was just completely rubble, and so this was sort of like a shock to let them know, oh my god, that actually just happened. And I just remembered, I don't know why I left this anecdote out. I would have kind of rolled back a little because it's hilarious, but right after Zuangwa died of smallpox, and while this Tangashuan II was still assuming power, the Aztecs sent their last embassy, and this was right before Tenochtitlan fell, and the ambassadors showed up and demanded to speak to the king, and they met with some of the lower officials, and they're like, no, we can't tell our message to you. Our instructions were explicit. We're only supposed to speak to Zuangwa. And at which point the Tarascans tell him, well, unfortunately for you, Zuangwa's dead, but we would be happy to send you to the afterlife, and you can tell him when you get there. So they sacrifice the Aztec ambassadors.
No small amount of bad blood there.
No, they don't get along at all. But anyways, Tangashuan II's fallen into this depression because all of his family's died. His brothers have been eliminated by him. And he's just realized what's happened to the Aztecs, and it's becoming clear through these diplomatic exchanges that the Spanish are planning to come to Tzintzuntzan as well. And it's sort of like this apocalyptic moment where he's realized, and especially after the smallpox outbreak, it's got to feel like an apocalyptic event. And Tangashuan II falls into this depression, and while he does this, Timas seizes power in the capital.
Yeah, actually, just one question: do we have accounts on your estimates about what actually was the effect of the smallpox epidemic in Michoacan at the time?
No.
So, yeah. I mean, we have very rough estimates, among the Aztecs, but mostly those are from Spanish sources that are kind of reinterpreted. But yeah.
Yeah, no, surprisingly, I've been very surprised because I've been looking through I've been looking through a lot of the literature on this, and a lot of people have been that have been worked in this region have been arguing or have been saying that there was no smallpox outbreak. But I mean, I could pull up the freaking passage in the Relación de Michoacan where it's titled. The title of the passage is like how the King Zuangwa and all of his lords died from smallpox.
Yeah,
so
which is backed up by Aztec and Spanish Mexica sources. So
right,
it's
so
a little weird. Yeah.
So the point is there hadn't been a whole lot of scholarship on exactly what the impact was here. Hopefully that will change in the coming years. It's interesting if we did this podcast, 10 years from now, we'll have so much more information on stuff like this.
Well, 10 years from now, people can look back and say, what these guys thinking?
Yeah, so, they might be saying that next week, so we don't know.
So a quick aside, actually, what was and this is just the kind of the physical anthropologist in me coming out, what actually is the burial practices of the Tarascans at the time?
The royalty were cremated. That's that's pretty established. The other people were buried. We just excavated a cemetery dating to right before and during the imperial period, and a lot of the burials were flexed. They were buried in sort of a
kind of a fetal position.
Kind of like either a fetal position or like just doubled over so that their heads are on their knees. But it's pretty I'd say it's roughly comparable to the kind of burial practices that you see in central Mexico.
Yeah, because elite cremation, commoner burial. So yeah, well, yeah. The reason I bring this up is just to kind of point out that the problem with establishing a smallpox epidemic is that it doesn't leave a lot of osteological lesions, unlike certain other disease. Yeah, so it's hard to find from the literal hard evidence of bones.
Right. Well, the other thing, and I don't know this, and I need to look into it, but the passage that describes the smallpox outbreak also describes that they were suffering bloody diarrhea, which doesn't sound
classic
like
sign of dysentery when it comes down to it.
Yeah, I think that there might have even been like there might have been multiple different diseases that they were being afflicted by. It might not have just been smallpox, because I don't think bloody diarrhea counts as a smallpox symptom.
that is not a symptom.
Yeah, I don't think so. So they might have actually had multiple different diseases that hit them at the same time. So it's pretty, but they make it sound like it was a pretty big deal. So okay, let's see, where were we? Timos had just seized power, I believe, and so what he then does is he starts trying to goad Tanguaxuan on in his depression, because Tanguaxuan's feeling depressed, and Timos is pitching this like this is like the end of the world, and he's like, we should all kill ourselves, and he sort of like promotes this big suicide pact amongst Tanguaxuan II and all of the upper nobility. And what's interesting about this suicide pact is it's a suicide pact that it appears like no one really had any intention of going through with it. I mean, on Timos' side, he's trying to get the king to kill himself so that he can take power. But if he kills himself as well, he can't do that. So that's obviously not part of the plan.
So it's more of a rhetorical point at this point, really.
Yeah, well, it's more like, I mean, it's kind of like one of these like, okay, we're all going to jump on 3, right? And then like some people do it and others don't. So, but that's Timos' plan. But at the same time, Tanguaxuan II doesn't look like he's really taking it seriously either, because Timos keeps trying to push him to kill himself and to stage this mass suicide, but he keeps coming up with excuses not to do it like at that moment. At one point, they're all like gathered on the lake shore, and they're all like, okay, we're all gonna like throw ourselves into the lake and drown ourselves, right? And one of the nobility who is trying to talk Tanguaxuan II out of doing this says something to the effect of like, well, are you really going to do this seriously? I mean, this is not a way for a king to die. You're going to go out like a commoner just throwing yourself into the lake like this. And Tanguaxuan II kind of turned and went, you're right. We should all be dressed up for this. We should, I mean, if we're going to go out, we should have some like pomp and ceremony, right? And so he kept like putting it off and kept trying to find excuses not to do it.
Let's find the old, jaguar pelts.
Yeah, and so while he was doing this, he was sort of secretly making plans to escape. So while all this is going on, Cortez decides to appoint his lieutenant, Cristobal de Olid, in charge of a large expedition to go and conquer and subdue what he called Michoacan, the kingdom of Tzintzuntzin, or the Tarascan Empire, depending on how you want to call it.
Following the Nahuatl name.
Yeah, and Cristobal de Olid gathers this army of mostly Aztec soldiers, but with a few Spanish accompanying him, and marches
as would be the practice of the conquest.
As the practice, right? And marches west. And of course, the border forts spot them coming, and send messages to the capital saying, "Hey, there's this giant army coming over here. What should we do about it?" And Timos, of course, gets these messages and goes, "Okay, we need to hurry this up. Like if we're gonna do this like suicide thing, it needs to be over with before the Spanish get here." And so he tries to sort of hurry the king up. The border forts, however, don't really get any response from the capital, because the capital is sort of paralyzed right now. The king is effectively being held prisoner by this rebellious general, and they're, about to stage this mass suicide, theoretically, even though no one's really actually going to do it.
Mass suicide, i.e., deposition of the king.
Yeah, and so so the border forts get no response. They get no indication from the capital, and these border forts, I mean, sure, they're in defensible positions, they have garrisons, but they're not really designed to withstand a prolonged siege by a massive army. They're supposed to be there just to hold the enemy down while they bring a real army up from behind to sort of reinforce the position. System. Right, and so they don't get any word from the capital, and so when Cristobal de Olid and his Aztec Spanish army shows up, they don't know what to do, and they just let him go. They just let him walk right across the border. And there's some messengers that are exchanged between Olid's army and the Aztecs that sort of describe the countryside between, the area ahead of Olid's army as just being in chaos. People are like packing up and abandoning their villages as this army's approaching and just fleeing in all directions. And there's some like rogue battalions of Tarascan soldiers that have no, leadership right now because the capital's paralyzed, and so they're sort of wandering around, not knowing where there's fighting, if there is fighting, what to do. It's a chaotic situation, and so eventually, the guys back in the capital decide, okay, today is the day. We're going to do it. We're going to throw ourselves in the lake. We're going to drown ourselves. It's going to be a big deal. And they gather. They all start drinking in advance, of course, preparing to theoretically throw themselves in this lake, even though no one really has any intention of actually doing it. And so while they're all getting drunk and preparing for this supposed mass suicide, Tangashuan, while he'd been stalling for time, had his servants build a secret door in the palace that went out into the street. And so while everyone's getting drunk in this festival preparing for this mass suicide, Tangashuan II slips out this secret door into the street and then escapes the capital. He gets out of the capital before Timos and his faction have figured out what has happened. And of course they go out chasing him, but they're drunk at this point, so they don't do a very good job and they can't find him. And he gets away and gets out of the capital where Timos has power and manages to sort of find some of the other lords in the countryside that are still loyal to him, and from there rebuilds his power base and manages to raise an army from everyone that he's got that's still loyal to him and not bought into Timos's BS. He raises this massive army and marches towards the capital, and right at this point, Cristobal de Olid shows up with his massive army, and so Tangashuan II's army and Cristobal de Olid's army square off.
So a classic example of what many Ask Historians users have asked about: what is an example of a three-way war?
Yeah, right. I mean, he didn't. Tangashuan II didn't have control of the capital really. I mean, Timos still did, and so when he squared off against Olid, he realized he wasn't in a strong position, and he had known what had happened to the Aztecs, right? I mean, the Tarascan ambassadors had been taken on a tour of the ruins of Tenochtitlan, so they knew what had happened, and he knew that he wasn't in a strong position. So even though he had this big army and he was squaring off against Olid, he decides not to fight. He decides that, he's not going to win this. He's not in a strong enough position to win this. Maybe if he'd met Olid at the border, like they had, the strategy was supposed to be.
If he had a defensible position to attack from.
Right, but at this point it was pointless, and he decided he could probably and because he still didn't really have control over the capital, he decided to sort of surrender without a fight. And so Cristobal de Olid and the other Spaniards in the army then go on a loot and plunder phase where they just wander around all the cities in the lake basin. They raid all of the temples where all the treasuries are stored, take everything for like a year, really, just looting and plundering.
Yeah, and presumably this was, I don't know what kind of accounts we have from them at the point, but, for any kind of account during the, Spanish conquest of the Aztecs, it's just like they're not looting, they're destroying idols.
Yeah, no, this was more clearly looting. I mean, they had these caches devoted to the, so that they didn't really keep treasure with individual lords. The king got to have treasure, but all the rest of the cool stuff in the empire was kept in these temple caches. And they basically just go around to each one, find anything they think is valuable, melt it down, ship it back, and anything that isn't valuable, they destroy. So a lot of that, I mean, God, I can't even imagine what kinds of awesome museum exhibits we would have on them if some of that stuff had survived.
Actually, just as a quick aside, I don't expect you to, know this perfectly, but I mean, do we have a particular museum or institution that has a good collection of, extant Tarascan items that we could look at?
There's a decent collection in Morelia. I forget the name of the museum. And then there's a small section of the INA Museum in Mexico City.
Yeah,
the National Museum of Anthropology and History, or just National Museum of Anthropology, in Mexico City. That's, by the way, for any listeners, the National Museum of Anthropology in Mexico City is a place that I think you should put on your bucket list of places to see before you die.
Yeah, it is probably the best collection of, pre-Columbian Mesoamerican artifacts in
It's
the world.
unbelievable. But
Yeah.
the thing is, like, we don't have that. You look at their section on the Tarascans, it's tiny because there's just not a whole lot. There's so much stuff that we know they had that we don't have anymore. Like, one of the things that they had that was supposedly really gorgeous, they had these shields, like a kind of shield that a warrior would carry, but they were made entirely of copper silver alloys, and were elaborately decorated and very ornamental. No examples survive. That's all gone.
Yeah,
So,
actually, well, that brings up a good question. And before we kind of start to wrap this up, I want to ask you a little bit about. So West Mexico is considered the central nucleus of metalworking, especially copper metalworking in the Americas. But a lot of people, are kind of confused by the fact that the metalworking there was not kind of. I mean, there were practical items, but most people assume that, well, you're working metal, you're working copper, you're working bronze. Why aren't you making weapons from it? So could you talk a little bit about that?
yeah, I mean, well, first off, you have to understand that metallurgy was a very new technology to the region, relatively speaking. The earliest metallurgy, I believe, shows up like 800, 900 AD, and it's basically just copper smelting at that point. Alloys, especially copper tin, copper arsenic, and copper silver, start showing up around 1200 AD, and then the conquest happens in 1522. So we're not, there's not a lot of time between when metallurgy first arrives in the region and when the Europeans do. But in addition to that, they also just had different perceptions of what metal was. To them, metal was gold and silver were to use their terms, the excrement of the sun and the moon, respectively. It was considered a divine substance that was produced as part of the.
Teoquiat is, the Nahuatl term, which literally means excrement of the gods.
Yeah, right.
For
I mean,
gold.
but it was seen as sort of a sacred substance, and their use of alloys was not so much. I mean, in some ways, copper arsenic and copper tin do provide more effective metalworking, easier to make elaborate structures that are more rigid using those alloys instead of just pure copper. But they were adding arsenic and tin to these alloys in concentrations that were far higher than was necessary to achieve the mechanical properties of those alloys. So the argument, which seems pretty reasonable to me, is that they were adding these other materials to the copper to change the color. If you add tin to copper in high enough concentrations, it looks gold. And if you add arsenic to copper in high enough concentrations, it looks silver. And so they were alloying these metals in order to create the appearance of gold and silver. And what was more important was its sort of religious qualities associated with those materials, and not so much the materials themselves.
Excellent. Yeah. So, and anyone who wants to read up on that can read anything written by, Dorothy Hostler in the past 3 decades.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, pretty much.
So we have, to return to the main thrust of the story, we have Olid looting these temples around, the Tarascan territory.
Right. So he loots all these temples, and then he turns around and he leaves. Right? And so all of a sudden, Tangashuan II has this army. The Spanish have left, and so the first thing he does is take back Pátzcuaro and immediately begins executing all of the people that had conspired in this coup attempt against him.
So why did the Spanish leave?
Well, at this point they were just there to subdue them, and they apparently had, because they didn't put up a fight. So they said, okay, well, we'll just take your treasure and leave.
Mission accomplished. Let's go home.
Yeah, pretty much. Tangashuan II then begins on going around culling all of the coup leaders who had attempted to plot against him. And Timos's execution was particularly dramatic because Kiniarangari, who's the guy that is reporting all of this information to us, and so you got to kind of take this story with a grain of salt. But supposedly Kiniarangari shows up at Timos's house and sort of knocks on the door, basically, and then Timos comes out, and Kiniarangari informs him that the king has issued a death sentence against him. And at this point, Timos starts trying to talk his way out of it, saying, no, I'm a friend of the king. I didn't do anything to him. And as he's trying to talk his way out of this, Timos pulls out a club Kiniarangari pulls out a club and bludgeons Timos to death right there on his own doorstep. So,
like you do.
Yeah, of course. I mean, get no trial for a guy like that. You just get him out. So Tangashuan II consolidates his power, resumes control of the capital, and then just kind of continues ruling like nothing had happened. The Spanish set up. They do a survey of the areas in 1524 to sort of, tabulate what settlements are where. Unfortunately, only fragments of that survey remain, it's really disappointing because that would be a great way to reconstruct population if we had the whole thing, but we don't. But they do the survey. They divide up encomiendas, and they start to settle it. But there's an early dispute amongst the conquistadors over who's going to get what encomienda. So it doesn't really happen, and Cortez decides that he doesn't want to devote time and energy to settling this region right now because he's more interested in establishing a port on the Pacific so that he can get boats up there to start sailing to China, which, at this point he's kind of under the assumption that it's still just like a hop, skip, and a jump across the Pacific.
Boat ride over.
Yeah, I don't think they really understand how massive the Pacific Ocean is. But they take over the port of Zacatula, which is that port that the Aztecs and the Tarascans were kind of fighting over for a long time on the mouth of the Rio Balsas. And before this, the Spanish eventually established their own port at Acapulco, and that becomes their main base on the Pacific. But before that, Zacatula, they just used the existing port of Zacatula. And one of the interesting stories from this period is that the very first fleet of ships to reach the Moluccas, which today Indonesia, was built at Zacatula, and as trade goods, they took a lot of stuff from the kingdom of Tzintzuntzan. They took a lot of these copper and bronze shields. They took all sorts of textiles and other metal, gold and silver metallurgy, and put them on these boats and shipped them to Indonesia. So I'm still kind of hoping that one day some guy in Indonesia is going to be like cleaning out his attic and find, one of these Tarascan shields that we've heard so much about but have been lost. It'd be an interesting history to find something like that. So they don't settle the region right away. The Spanish just sort of leave them to their own devices, and they don't really begin, the Spanish encomenderos don't begin settling the region until like 1528. And when they first arrive, the locals are not really sure who's in charge because they're still part of this, the kingdom of Tzintzuntzan. They're still paying tribute to Tengishwan II. And so they kind of just play along and pay both the Spanish and the Tarascan monarchy separate taxes. And this goes on until 1530, when there's another conquistador named Nuno de Guzman who, let's sort of set the record straight, Nuno de Guzman was just technically supposed to just be passing through the kingdom of Tzintzuntzan. He wasn't supposed to stay there. He was on his way to go rape and pillage West Mexico, which I do not think is an exaggeration. I mean, rape and pillage is probably a mild way to put what he did to Western Mexico. He's one of the only conquistadors, I believe, that was actually recalled to Spain for, among other things, excessive cruelty towards the Indians, which you've got to kind of look at what the other conquistadors are doing and go, man, what do you have to do to sort of make those guys go, I don't know.
He's a conquistador who is excessively cruel. Yeah,
yeah, it's for the other conquistadors to consider that. But he's, what he did in West Mexico has been called genocidal, so it was bad. But he, on his way over there to go, rip and pillage, he stopped at Tzintzuntzan and found out, lo and behold, Tengishwan II was still running his kingdom as if nothing had happened, and he, like as if he was still the king. And so Nuño de Guzman ends up conspiring with Kini Arangari, who's the guy that's given us this whole story, right? I mean, the guy that's the principal informant for the Spanish chronicler writing this is the one who ends up teaming up with Nuño de Guzman to depose Tengishwan II. So they depose him, then they stage this trial, which is where they accuse him of collecting tribute from Spanish subjects, which you got to kind of understand from his perspective. It's like, well, these were my people, I don't know why I didn't do anything. I didn't change anything. I don't know why, I'm in trouble here. But they also make up a list of other bogus charges, things like sodomy and, idolatry and a whole bunch of charges that are kind of like half true but mostly made up.
Yeah, it's the crime of not being Spanish, essentially.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. What? You're a king and you're not Spanish? No. Yeah. That's exactly what it was. And so they trump up all these charges. They give him this speedy trial, and then burn him. I think they actually drag him behind a horse first. I'm not 100% on that, but they give him this brutal death, and they very unceremoniously dump his ashes into the Rio Lerma.
So,
and
was there resistance to the Spanish at this point?
Not really. I mean, this is it just kind of ended with a whimper. I mean, you look at something like the Aztecs where they went out fighting, kicking and screaming, tooth and nail. This was just sort of they surrendered without fighting, hung around as an independent, semi-technically dependent, but really independent kingdom for the next 8 years, and then once Tangashuan II was deposed, that was the last of the Wakusecha dynasty, the last of these Chichimek kings, and so Kiniarangari, who is then rechristened as Don Pedro, takes over as the governor. So, after siding with Nuno de Guzman to depose the monarch, which is really, I mean, Kiniarangari is a weird character because he helped foil this first coup attempt against Timas, only to launch a coup attempt of his own that succeeded by teaming up with the Spanish. So it's a weird story, but that's the end basically. I mean, it's not a peaceful incorporation, but it's not the kind of violent struggle resistance that you saw with the Aztecs.
Yeah, well, I mean, at least in some sense, if we're talking about a bit of an epilogue here, is that the Tarascan state has been preserved in the sense that Michoacan is in fact still a state within the nation of Mexico.
Yeah, and the borders are almost exactly the same as the borders were in 1521. There are some slight modifications, and obviously they had expanded and contracted over the various centuries, but pretty much the borders of Michoacan today are more or less the borders of the ancient kingdom.
Yeah, so today, to kind of put a final end cap on it, how are the Purepecha people, how many people still speak the language? How many people still identify with an ethnic group?
Oh, I don't know. I know where they are geographically. The western end of the lake basin has a large Purepecha community still. The eastern end speaks mostly Spanish. I don't know. I would have to look this up. I don't know how many people there are still, but it's not as many as there are Nahuatl speakers. The Aztec people.
Yeah, because we have Nahuatl speakers spread basically from the northern central Mexico down into Central America, of course.
Yeah, and the Purepecha had always kind of been a cultural and linguistic isolate within Mesoamerica, kind of straddling western Mexico and central Mexico, but kind of marginally interacting with both of them, and they didn't really spread out beyond the borders of the state. And a lot of the groups, keep in mind that a lot of the people that were subject to Tarascan dominance were not ethnically Purepecha. They were other ethnic groups like Otomi and stuff, and so they just never learned the language. Or they might have learned it as a second language, but then dropped it once it was no longer relevant.
So just as, one final note before we close this up, what is the significance of the Tarascan state, essentially, in understanding the history of Mesoamerica and in early colonial Mexico, when it comes down to it?
Well, I mean, for me, the biggest thing to remember is most people don't even know this empire existed, so just knowing that it exists, I think, is an important step. And they were, for a very brief period, they were the largest empire in Mesoamerica. And at the time of European contact, they were the third largest empire in the Americas after the Inca and the Aztecs. And as to what their significance was, I mean, they're often brushed under the rug. For most of the history of scholarship in Mesoamerica, people saw this region as somehow less complex and less sophisticated. And the main reason for that, I think, is that their monumental architecture was not as big as something you would see amongst the Aztecs or the Maya, for example. They built pyramids, but they weren't the kind of towering colossus pyramids that you are accustoed to seeing with those cultures.
Kind of a key form, right?
Yeah, it was sort of a keyhole shape, and it was a lot. Not all of them. Some of them were more traditionally shaped pyramids, but they were a lot smaller than that, more comparable to what you would see amongst the Mixtecs or the Zapotecs. They also didn't work a whole lot of carved stone monuments. They had some petroglyphs on stones, which of course no one knows what they mean today, so who knows. But they didn't do a whole lot in the way of like stone sculpture. They were big into woodworking and metallurgy. Of course, woodworking does not preserve archaeologically. And metallurgy was problematic because the Spanish just melted all that down, so there's not a whole lot left. So the stuff that they were really known for artistically and technologically is stuff that has not survived. And so they're often portrayed in this way as being somehow less complex than their neighbors, even though it's not that they were less complex, it's just that the ways that they were complex are not as readily visible today. And I think it's a region that deserves more attention than it gets, because This was a major empire. They fought against the Aztecs. They were, major regional players in the politics, and I think that understanding them I think that the cultural differences between them and Central Mexico were about as sharp as Central Mexico's cultural differences between, like, the Maya, for example, between Central Mexico and the Maya. It's a big cultural gap, and if you don't understand them, you're missing a big piece of the cultural tapestry that is Mesoamerica.
Well, Snickeringshadow, thank you very much for talking with us today. This has been incredibly informative.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I've enjoyed this. I don't normally get to talk about this stuff because most people don't even know enough about them to ask an informed question. So
anyone who listens to this podcast, or these podcasts, really, when it comes down to it, are going to be basically, I would even say, probably experiencing the most condensed form of Tarascan history available on the web right now. So, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I had fun.
And there you have it. Probably the largest collection of easily accessible and easy to learn and pleasant on the ears information about the Tarascans available anywhere on the interwebs or any series of tubes you can find. Coming up in the next fortnight, I'll be talking to AC7 about the Battle of France. You can always find us on the web at reddit.com/r/AskHistorians. We have a special podcast section if you look in the sidebar there. You can also go to our Libsyn page, which is askhistorians.libsyn.com, where we have all the podcasts selected there. And of course, we're available on iTunes, where you can, if you like the show, you can rate us. And if you don't like the show, you can not rate us. You can, of course, leave any feedback you want on the discussion posts that we put up in Ask Historians each time one of these episodes come out. We check those for days afterwards, so don't feel shy if you've just downloaded the podcast today and only got to listen to it a few days later. If you have any questions, you can feel free to put them in the post there, or even put them up as a question themselves in Ask Historians. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed all of this. I certainly did. See you next week, or next fortnight anyway.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. For more history like this, visit us at reddit.com/r/AskHistorians and ask over 100 historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know in history. Find us on Twitter as @AskHistorians and subscribe to the show on iTunes. Or visit askhistorians.libsyn.com. Thank you very much for listening, and join us next time on the